A shimmer of heat hung above Riverbend as townsfolk clustered around a crude sign that read, "3 dogs, $10." In the dust beneath it stood 3 German shepherd pups, burlap sacks shoved over their heads, ropes cutting into their ribs. He hadn't come here for this. Just a Marine passing through. A man who had promised himself he would never rescue again. But when the smallest pup turned toward him through the cloth, as if whispering his name, the entire noise of the square seemed to vanish. No one noticed his hands tremble. No one expected him to step forward. Yet he remembered the vow he once made, and what it truly meant to be saved. What came next would move hearts and prove that even the forgotten deserve a second chance. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from, share your country in the comments. And if you believe that no life, human or animal, should be abandoned, hit subscribe. This story just might remind you that miracles still happen. That morning, Riverbend felt heavy with humidity, the kind that clung to skin and refused to let go. Low clouds hovered above the levees, streaked brown where the river had spat mud skyward during the last storm. The air carried the weight of wet soil, resin from pine, and faint traces of smoke from chimneys still burning kindling, though spring was already leaning toward summer. Riverbend was a small Louisiana town, wedged between the wide bend of the river and worn-out farmland, where routine was the line between survival and ruin. It was market day, and the square bustled with wagon wheels clattering, merchants shouting, neighbors calling to one another by name, or by reputation. Ethan Ward strode along Main Street with his shoulders squared, his step steady, like a soldier still walking patrol rather than a drifter passing through a place he once called home. At 38, he was tall and broad, the lean muscle of decades in uniform shaping his frame. His face was weather-worn, his jaw shadowed with stubble, and a thin scar etched his left forearm, not from fences or farm work, but shrapnel. His dark brown hair, close-cropped with the first dusting of gray at the temples, still carried the mark of military discipline. But it was his eyes, gray-green, sharp yet hollow, that betrayed him. They held vigilance and emptiness both, the watchfulness of a man who had lost more than he could count. Ethan rarely spoke. Not because he was cold, but because words had failed him once, on a battlefield where even shouts could not stop what was coming. To Riverbend's people, he was only fragments, the ward boy who went to the Marines. The quiet man who lived alone. Some whispered he was a widower, but the truth was simpler, sadder, he had never married, and his family had long since died. Each week he came to market, bought what he needed, flour, beans, lamp oil, and left before gossip could weigh him down. He hadn't planned to stop today. But the sound drew him in. A sharpness in voices, the kind reserved for spectacle, pulled him toward the crowd despite his better judgment. In the center of the square, beside a leaning notice post, 3 figures stood in the dirt. At first glance, Ethan thought they were children, the sacks over their heads slumped around small shoulders. But then he saw the trembling legs, the shifting paws straining against ropes. 3 shepherd pups. 6, maybe 8 months old. Bound so tight their ribs pressed inward, the rough cloth choking their breath. A sign leaned against the post, 3 dogs, $10. No questions. The man presiding was Gerald Pike, known around town as Red Pike for his sunburned face. Thick around the waist, suspenders stretched across a sweat-stained shirt, his thinning hair slicked to the side. His eyes carried the weariness of a man used to being challenged, but too tired to fight back. Scratching his neck with stubby fingers, Gerald called out, $10 takes the lot. Shepherd pups, good workers if you can tame 'em. Don't ask where they come from, just ask what they'll do for you. His words whined with false cheer, a salesman's tune even he didn't believe. Gerald wasn't cruel on purpose, but years of debts had made him see every living thing as either burden or bargain. The crowd pressed in, as people often do when cruelty is on display, so long as guilt stayed far enough away. Mrs. Agnes Turner, a sharp-tongued widow, muttered through her cane, "Mean little brutes. Heard they bit the last man straight through the hand." Beside her, Clyde Dillard, a stoop-shouldered rice farmer, spat into the dirt. 3 devils, that's what they are. Ain't nobody keeping them long. The pups were spoken of like curses, not living beings. A few young men laughed, nudging each other, betting how long before some fool bought them and regretted it. Ethan lingered at the edge of the circle, but his eyes locked on the pups. His chest caught, the market's noise fading into memory. He wasn't in Riverbend anymore. He was in the desert, half a world away, sandstorm raging. Beside him, Atlas, his canine partner, a sable shepherd, had once dragged him clear of an improvised mine with a tug so strong it nearly wrenched his arm. Atlas had saved his life. And then, one day, Atlas was gone, taken in a blast. Ethan survived. He had buried him with his own hands in foreign soil. Now here, seeing these pups trussed like criminals, the ache tore through him again. Not again, he whispered, too quiet for anyone else to hear. Not like this. Gerald Pike's patience thinned. He yanked one pup forward by the rope. The animal stumbled, sack twisting, legs buckling clumsily. The crowd chuckled. "See, can't even stand straight," Gerald barked, though unease cracked his voice. The tallest pup, Axel, though Ethan didn't yet know his name, steadied himself despite the sack, stiff and proud. The second, Rex, whimpered low, nervous. The smallest, Milo, simply trembled, then froze, as if stillness could make him invisible. $10. Gerald shouted. 3 beasts. Don't eat much, don't make noise. Train them for guards, if you've got the patience. No one stepped forward. He huffed, shoving the smallest with the toe of his boot. The pup yelped, muffled inside the sack, and the crowd laughed again. That's when Ethan moved. He stepped into the circle with a calmness more threatening than fury. His boot struck the ground, sharp as punctuation. The crowd parted instinctively. Gerald squinted. "Here for one, Ward?" he asked, voice caught between hope and dread. Ethan didn't answer. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a worn leather wallet. Inside, just a few bills, his week's money. He drew a frayed $10 note and pressed it into Gerald's palm. "All 3, Ethan said. His voice low, steady, carrying the weight of a man used to commands being obeyed. The square fell silent. Mrs. Turner's cane froze mid-tap. Clyde's spit dried where it fell. "All 3. Gerald repeated, as if he hadn't heard right. "That's the lot. No returns." Ethan's gray-green eyes narrowed. "Untie them." Gerald shifted uneasily, sweat glistening at his temples. "Ward, you don't know what you're buying. They ain't trained. Don't bark, don't cry, haven't eaten since sunup. Seller said keep the sacks on, could be mute, could be worse." His laugh rang false. "Untie them," Ethan said again. This time the command in his voice left no room. Grumbling, Gerald drew a pocketknife and cut the ropes one by one. The sacks dropped. The first pup lifted his head, pale blue eyes too large for his gaunt face. He stood unflinching. The second revealed a bruise under one eye, a scab at his lip, gaze darting everywhere but never settling. The smallest blinked at the light, then fixed his gaze directly on Ethan. For a moment, the square was utterly still. Then the pup gave a sound, not loud, not fearful, just a small, certain whine. A whisper of a call. Ethan's chest tightened. He said nothing. Only reached out a steadying hand. "Come with me," he murmured. And this time, the market had no reply. The crowd in Riverbend Square slowly broke apart as Ethan led the 3 young shepherds toward the edge of town. Whispers trailed after him, some shaking their heads at wasted money, others murmuring pity or curiosity. Ethan ignored them all. His boots struck the damp planks of the walkway in a steady rhythm, the pup stumbling alongside, blinking at the sudden light after the stifling sacks had been cut away. The eldest, Axel, already stood nearly 20 inches at the shoulder, too long-limbed for his narrow frame. His sable coat carried dark ridges, though patches were rubbed raw where rope had dug against him. His pale blue eyes, uncommon for a shepherd, were bright as river ice, strange and haunting. Though swaying from hunger, he carried himself stiffly, daring the world to test his strength. Rex, the middle pup, was leaner. A black saddle marking stretched across his back, a faint scar etched across his muzzle, the kind chains leave on tender skin. His ears twitched constantly, his brown eyes darting from face to face as though every passerby might strike. A cough from the crowd sent him crouching so low his belly nearly touched the boards, flinching from an invisible blow. The smallest, Milo, was hardly 6 months old. His fur, tan-streaked with darker patches around his ears, was dulled with grime. His ribs pressed sharp against skin, legs trembling as he tried to keep pace. But his dark eyes, wide and unwavering, never left Ethan. Where Axel carried defiance and Rex suspicion, Milo offered something else, a fragile trust that could shatter with a harsh word, yet grow fierce if nurtured. At the edge of the square, Ethan stopped beside his old Jeep. The vehicle looked as worn as its owner, an early 1970s CJ model with moss-colored paint peeling away, a windshield cracked in one corner, and mud caked deep in the treads. It had once belonged to his father, who drove it to fish the bayous before his health failed. Now it was Ethan's only companion for the long drives between town and the levees. "Up you go," Ethan murmured, lowering the tailgate. Axel hesitated only a moment before leaping in, claws scraping metal. Rex followed more cautiously, scanning the street as though expecting a trap. Milo tried, slipped, and whined softly. Ethan sighed, scooped him up, and set him gently with the others. For a brief second, Milo pressed his thin body to Ethan's chest, releasing a faint vibration of a whine that nearly formed into something like his name. Ethan slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and caught sight of a figure by the well across the road. Sarah Calloway, Riverbend seamstress, stood tall despite her years. A narrow face framed by iron-gray hair pulled into a bun that had not loosened in 2 decades of work. She carried herself upright from years bent over sewing tables, discipline stitched into her bones. Sarah had raised 3 children alone after a flood had taken her husband. Hardship had sharpened her, but carved quiet compassion beneath the surface. She caught Ethan's gaze, gave the smallest nod, then glanced toward the pups huddled in the Jeep bed. "They'll break you if you're not careful," she called, her voice sharp as scissors cutting cloth. Then, after a pause, softer, "But if anyone can mend broken things, it might be you." Without waiting for an answer, she turned and disappeared back into the crowd. The road out of Riverbend was muddy from the storm, ruts jolting the Jeep at every turn. Cypress knees jutted from waterlogged ditches, cicadas buzzed beneath heavy clouds. Ethan drove in silence, glancing occasionally into the rearview mirror. Axel lay stiff, paws crossed, eyes locked on the blur of passing trees. Rex crouched low, ears twitching at every splash of water beneath the tires. Milo propped his head against the Jeep's side, gazing through the window at Ethan, as though memorizing his face. Halfway home, the road dipped near the levee where floodwater had pooled. The Jeep splashed through, water licking the hubcaps. The pups stirred uneasily. Milo whimpered once, then pressed his paw against the glass. Without thinking, Ethan reached back, palm brushing the tiny paw through the window. Milo's eyes glistened, and he licked the glass where Ethan's hand met his, as if sealing a silent vow. The gesture struck Ethan deeper than he expected. His throat tightened, and for a moment he was back in the desert, crouched beside Atlas after the blast, whispering through sand-choked air, "Don't leave me." Not yet. Back then, he had begged for someone to need him again, someone to call his name and make the world bearable. Now Milo's gaze was that answer. Whether Ethan could bear the weight of it, he didn't know. The Jeep crested a hill, and the ward cabin came into view. A squat wooden house perched at the edge of a valley where tall pines swayed above a creek carving through thick underbrush. The paint had long peeled, windows clouded with dust, the barn leaning as though tired of standing. But it was shelter. It was his. Ethan parked by the porch, cut the engine, and waited in the hush that followed. The pups shifted restlessly until he opened the tailgate. Axel leapt first, steady despite his gaunt frame. Rex sniffed the ground nervously before following. Milo hesitated. He looked up at Ethan, almost as if waiting for permission. Ethan crouched, extending a hand. "Come on, little one." Milo licked his palm once, then jumped down. The three of them stood in the yard, eyes fixed on him, one defiant, one wary, one hopeful. The wind shifted, pine branches whispered, a crow cried in the distance. Something stirred inside Ethan, heavier than he had realized he still carried. He had believed he was done being responsible for lives after the war. But here they were, fragile, fierce, waiting for him. Milo pressed against his leg, tongue brushing Ethan's hand again, dark eyes shimmering with trust too pure for this world. Ethan swallowed hard. It wasn't just affection. It was a plea. A claim. "You are the one. You are the answer." He remembered kneeling at Atlas's grave, whispering to the dirt, "Let someone need me again. Let someone say my name." Now, on this damp Louisiana evening, he realized the prayer had been answered. Not by comrades. Not by people. But by three battered creatures the world had cast aside. Looking down at Milo, then at Axel and Rex, his voice trembled for the first time in years. "You're mine now, all of you. And I'll be yours." The market's laughter, the gossip of townsfolk, the years of silence, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the feel of a pup's tongue on his hand, and the certainty in three pairs of eyes that he was no longer alone. The Ward cabin sat quiet at the edge of the valley, its bones old but still standing. Built nearly 70 years ago by Ethan's grandfather, it carried the weight of time. The paint had long peeled away, the roof sagged where storms had hammered it, and the porch leaned like a weary soldier refusing to rest. Behind the house, an abandoned chicken coop sagged under weeds, and the garden lay swallowed by mud. It was not much. But to Ethan, it was home. He parked the jeep, cut the engine, and listened. The silence was broken only by the low croak of frogs and the groan of the levee gates in the distance. The pups scrambled from the jeep one by one. Axel leapt down first, landing firm though his body was thin, his pale blue eyes scanning the yard as if on guard. Rex crept down slower, muzzle twitching, ears pricked at every sound, the flap of the coop door, the creak of the barn beams. Milo lingered until Ethan offered his arms again. Then the little one leapt softly, pressing close to his leg, as though to say once more, "I am yours." Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. Ethan lit a lamp, its glow spilling across scratched walls, some marked with carved initials, some scarred by furniture long gone. The hearth still held warmth from the morning fire, and in a cupboard sat jars of dried beans, cornmeal, and flour. Ethan set a battered tin bowl on the floor, filling it with what scraps he had left, crumbs of cornbread soaked in milk, bits of venison dried from last winter's hunt. The pups fell on it ravenous. Axel ate quickly, though one eye never left Ethan. Rex jerked back at every clink of the spoon, as if bracing for a blow. Milo nudged gently between his brothers only when their hunger eased, cautious but patient. When they finished, Ethan pulled 3 folded wool blankets from a cedar chest. They were old military issue, coarse and gray, but they still carried the faint scent of cedar from years stored away. He spread them before the fire, side by side. Axel circled once and collapsed, curling protectively around himself. Rex lay stiff, paws tucked beneath him, ears twitching. Milo crawled straight to Ethan's boot, sighing as he pressed his thin body against it. Ethan crouched, rubbing the little pup's head. His voice was quiet, almost more to himself than to them. "Not much. But it's what I have. Safe here. Safer than anywhere else." He glanced around the cabin with a soldier's eye for imperfection, a shutter hanging loose, the barn groaning in disrepair, the fields overrun. He had lived with those flaws without care, needing little more than a roof and silence. But now, standing with 3 pairs of eyes turned toward him, he saw it differently. It's not beautiful, he thought. But maybe it can be enough. Later, as dusk turned to night, Ethan stepped outside to fetch wood. Across the valley, his neighbor Hollis Dunn walked the fence line with a lantern. A wiry man in his 60s, back bent from decades of work, hair silver beneath a broad hat. He raised his lantern when he spotted Ethan. "Ward," he called, his voice carrying over the creek. "Heard you brought something home from market." His tone wasn't sharp, only curious, the sound of a man who'd seen enough strange things to be surprised by little. "They're just pups," Ethan replied, hefting wood in his arms. Hollis squinted across the dark. "Pups with sacks on their heads, rope on their legs. Don't sound like just pups to me. Folks say they bite." He muttered to himself as he always did, then lowered his lantern and carried on down the fence line. Hollis wasn't cruel, but loss had left him wary. Storms had taken his cattle, floods had swallowed his fields, anything new, to him, was a risk. Inside, Ethan stoked the fire until flames licked high. The pups shifted uneasily, restless in the stillness. Axel's ears flicked, a low growl building at shadows flickering along the wall. Rex tucked himself tighter, scarred muzzle hidden beneath his paw. Milo whimpered, pressing so close to Ethan's leg his little body trembled against it. Ethan lowered into the chair by the hearth, watching them. The fire crackled, embers hissed, frogs groaned in the distance. Then it came, a sound that cut the fragile calm. Axel's head snapped toward the door, a growl rising deep in his chest. Rex flattened himself against the blanket, whimpering. Milo's whine grew high and thin, shaking like a broken string. Ethan rose, every muscle taut. His hand rested on Axel's head. "Easy," he whispered. He cracked the door open. Nothing but the heavy night stared back, the pines shifting in the wind. He closed the door, bolted it, and turned back. The pups hadn't moved. Their eyes glowed in the firelight, carrying something carved into them by cruelties he had yet to uncover. Ethan crouched, resting his hand on Milo's trembling back. He looked at Axel, whose growl still rumbled. At Rex, whose eyes flicked nervously. At Milo, whose soft cry tugged at his chest. "They've been through hell," Ethan murmured, his voice barely above the fire's hiss. "Now it's my turn. My turn to stand for them." The flames popped, sparks racing up the chimney. Outside, the levee groaned against the rising water. But inside that cabin, a vow was forged. Not in ceremony, not carved into stone, but in the quiet resolve of a man who had decided to protect what no one else would. Morning in Riverbend carried a damp weight, the kind of heaviness that clung to the skin. Gray clouds loomed, swollen with rain not yet fallen. The Ward cabin creaked as wind pressed against it, pine needles scratching across the roof like ghostly fingers. Ethan woke early, as he always did. Sleep had been shallow. He stripped down at the basin near the back porch, filling it with cold creek water hauled the night before. The shock of it made him gasp, but he endured, splashing it across face and shoulders. When he peeled off his shirt, his body told its own story. Pale scars streaked across his chest and ribs, some long and thin from shrapnel, one ugly gouge where a bullet had torn through. His left forearm bore a raised ridge of scar tissue that tugged each time he flexed his hand. Ethan had grown used to these marks. But standing in the early light, he traced them with grim recognition. He reached for a small tin of salve, homemade by an old midwife, thick with pine resin and beeswax, and rubbed it gently across each scar. Not for healing. They had healed long ago. But as ritual. A reminder that though broken, he still endured. From the yard came a bark, sharp and commanding. Axel was awake, pacing around the sagging chicken coop near the fence line. The sable-coated pup moved like a sentry, stiff-legged and purposeful, blue eyes locked on the empty wire as if expecting an enemy. Rex, however, had crawled under the porch steps, ears pinned back, shivering at the faint rumble of thunder far off. Storms made him flinch violently, each clap like a whip crack. Milo, as always, had followed Ethan. The small pup sat close by his heel, head tilted upward, eyes filled with something that looked like devotion. He refused to let even a few feet of distance separate them. Ethan dressed, tugged on his boots, and stepped into the muddy yard. Axel bounded toward him, tail rigid, eyes burning with energy. "You're too young to be a guard," Ethan muttered, though the pride in his tone betrayed him. He whistled low, a sharp sound that came instinctively, drilled into him from years with military dogs. Axel froze instantly, ears erect. Rex peeked nervously from under the porch. Milo wagged his tail, uncertain but eager. "Sit," Ethan commanded. His voice carried the clipped cadence of command. Axel obeyed at once, dropping into a stiff sit. Rex hesitated, then lowered himself slowly, eyes darting toward the sky. Milo plopped down clumsily, his hind legs sprawling as if his body had not yet learned balance. Ethan crouched and scratched behind their ears, his tone softening. "Good. We'll get there." The morning passed with drills. "Sit. Stay. Come. Heel." Ethan's commands were firm, but never cruel. Axel caught on quickly, sharp, eager, almost hungry to please. Rex obeyed only after hesitation, flinching at sudden movement, but steady once guided. Milo was clumsy, but his eyes never left Ethan. His focus was pure, unbroken. As they trained, something stirred in Ethan's chest. For the first time since Atlas, he felt the rhythm of a bond forming. That unspoken language between man and dog. By midday the sky had darkened, and rain came in a steady sheet. Ethan built a small fire inside, propping his wet boots by the hearth. The pups huddled nearby, Axel closest to the door, Rex pressed into the corner at every thunderclap, Milo curled tight against Ethan's foot. The storm rattled the shutters. The swollen creek roared against the levee. That evening Ethan simmered a thin stew of beans and salt pork, ladling it into bowls. Axel devoured his share quickly, Rex ate cautiously, eyes fixed on the door, while Milo nibbled gently before edging closer to Ethan's knee. Afterward, Ethan settled in the wooden chair near the fire. The pups lay on their blankets, shadows stretching across the cabin walls. The air grew quiet, save for the hiss of embers and the rain on the roof. Then it began. Axel stirred first. His body twitched as though running in sleep, paws jerking, breath hitching. A low whimper grew into a sharp cry, then into a mournful howl that split the silence. His legs kicked violently against unseen terrors. Ethan rose instantly, kneeling at his side. "Easy," he whispered, laying a steady hand on Axel's flank. But the pup thrashed harder, eyes clamped shut, trapped in a nightmare. Rex whimpered from his corner, curling tight, while Milo scrambled to climb into Ethan's lap, his small body trembling. Ethan wrapped his arms around Axel, pulling him against his chest. "It's not real," he murmured, voice firm though his throat was heavy. "You're safe." Axel's body trembled violently, muscles locked with terror. Ethan pressed his face close to the pup's ear, whispering like a secret. "You're safe now. You hear me? Safe." Slowly, the trembling eased. The howl fell into broken whimpers, then into exhausted silence. Finally, Axel sagged, his head heavy on Ethan's chest. For the first time since the market square, Axel surrendered. Ethan held him long after the nightmare had passed, his hands stroking the coarse fur, firelight flickering across both their scars. Man and dog, each carrying wounds invisible to others. "Now it's my turn," Ethan whispered, almost like a prayer. "My turn to guard you. You're home now. You're safe." The rain of the previous night had left Riverbend restless. Mud clung to narrow streets, and the river pressed hard against the levee, whispering its threat of flood. News traveled quickly here, faster than water, faster than reason. By the time Ethan walked into town the next Sunday morning, word had already spread. He had brought 3 half-starved shepherds into his cabin. To some, it was foolishness. To others, danger. Reverend Elias Cole stood on the church steps, a tall, spare man in his late 60s. His hair, white as ash, stirred in the breeze, and his eyes carried the weight of decades spent watching over Riverbend. His coat was neatly pressed, though his hands trembled faintly when folded behind his back. Life had hollowed his cheeks, and the loss of his wife years earlier had gentled his voice, though not its firmness. He believed truth, even spoken softly, should strike like thunder. When Ethan paused near the churchyard to tie a bootlace, Reverend Cole descended a step. "I heard," he said, voice low so it would not carry. "They say you took the pups, the ones bagged and bound." Ethan straightened. "I did." Cole studied him for a long moment, searching his face. "Those animals have passed through more hands than cattle at auction. No one wanted them. That makes them dangerous." Ethan's jaw tightened. Dangerous, or abandoned? The Reverend sighed, rubbing his lined brow. "I've seen men try to keep such creatures. A few managed, most did not. If they were sold once, they may be claimed again. Men who deal in lives rarely forget a profit lost." His eyes softened, but his words were weighted. "Watch the shadows. They'll come." Back at the cabin, Ethan considered the Reverend's warning as he worked with the pups. Training had moved beyond obedience, he had begun sharpening their vigilance. Axel patrolled the gate at the property's edge, blue eyes alert, movements precise as if born to guard. Rex learned to follow scents through the marshy woods, nervous energy channeled into determination once a trail caught his nose. Milo, smaller and younger, never left Ethan's side. Loyal, constant, his watchfulness was of a different kind, his gaze never straying from the man who had become his anchor. Ethan marked their progress with quiet pride, though he said little aloud. The townsfolk, however, were not as generous. Mrs. Agnes Turner muttered to neighbors that Ward was raising wolves. Clyde Dillard shook his head whenever Ethan passed, whispering, "A man carries enough ghosts without inviting more to bite his heels." Children dared each other to creep close to the Ward property, only to scatter shrieking when Axel's bark ripped the air like a warning shot. The cabin, once a place ignored, had become the subject of hushed stories around market stalls. The Marine who guarded his loneliness with beasts. That evening, as the sun bled purple and gold behind the pines, a rider appeared at the gate. The man was of medium height, shoulders hunched beneath a coat too fine for fieldwork but too worn for dignity. His slicked back hair glistened with oil, his mustache trimmed into sharp points framing a mouth trained for bargaining. He dismounted slowly, eyes darting toward the dogs. The shepherds saw him first. Axel planted himself at the gate, hackles raised, teeth bared, growl rolling low and steady. Rex hovered uncertainly behind him, muzzle twitching, torn between fear and defiance. Milo pressed himself to Ethan's leg, trembling but refusing to retreat. The man raised a folded paper, its seal smudged, writing crude. "Name's Carson," he said in an oily, practiced tone. "Got business. Those dogs? They're mine." He waved the paper. "Signed, sealed. You've no right to keep them." Ethan stepped forward, shotgun resting casually across his arm, his gray-green eyes fixed on Carson with unblinking calm. "They're not yours." Carson smirked, tapping the paper. "Says different. You don't want trouble, hand them over. Folks won't take kindly to neighbors harboring dangerous animals." Ethan's grip on the shotgun tightened. Axel snarled, lunging against the gate, blue eyes blazing. Milo whimpered, pressing harder into his leg. When Ethan spoke, his voice came low, steady, each syllable like iron hammered into place. "They're not dangerous. They're not for sale. They're family." The last word struck harder than the weapon in his hands. Carson's smile faltered. His eyes flicked once more between the dogs and the man's unyielding stare. He saw no bargain to win here. Tucking the paper into his coat, he mounted his horse. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "Nobody keeps what doesn't belong." He wheeled the horse and rode into the dusk, leaving dust and threat hanging in the air. Ethan stood at the gate long after Carson vanished, shotgun still in his grasp, the dogs pressed close. Riverbend's undercurrents had shifted. Whispers had turned into warning. And the Reverend's words echoed in his mind, "Watch the shadows. They'll come." The storm that had stalked Riverbend for days finally broke in the dead of night. Rain poured in sheets so heavy the world blurred into a single gray wall, sky and earth indistinguishable. The river, already swollen from weeks of spring storms, pressed harder against the levee until the old gates moaned like wounded beasts. Ethan woke to the roar of water slapping against the porch steps, the cabin trembling as if caught in invisible hands. He dragged on his boots and coat, lantern in hand. When he stepped outside, the creek was no longer a creek but a raging channel, foaming and spilling into the yard. Somewhere upriver, the levee had burst. The flood was coming, and nothing could stop it. Inside, the dogs sensed it too. Axel paced, hackles high, pale eyes burning. Rex crouched low, whimpering with each clap of thunder, but his body was taut, ready to move. Milo clung to Ethan's heel, trembling, his thin whine drowned by the storm's roar. Training took over. Ethan ran to the barn, grabbed a coil of rope, looped it around his waist, and tied the other end to a support beam in the attic. "We're moving up," he said calmly, the way he used to steady men under fire. One by one, he hauled the pups up the crawlspace ladder. Axel scrambled first, claws scraping the wood. Rex hesitated, but Ethan steadied him with a firm hand. Milo clung tight to his chest as Ethan climbed last. The attic was cramped, the rafters groaning under the storm's assault. Ethan ripped open an old chest, stuffing a canvas sack with jerky, a water flask, and blankets. When he tossed the bag toward the attic window, Rex surprised him, snatching the strap in his teeth, dragging it toward the opening with stubborn strength until it toppled onto the slanted roof outside. For once, the timid pup did not shrink. He looked at Ethan as if to say, "I can carry this." The water rose fast, black and furious, dragging branches, logs, even the shattered remains of a wagon that slammed against the cabin walls. Ethan shoved the attic window open, wind and rain striking them in a blast. "Axel, out," he commanded. The eldest shepherd leapt through the window, claws sinking into slick shingles, body steady against the storm. He turned back, defiant, ready. Ethan followed with Milo pressed to his chest, Rex right behind, the canvas bag dragging after him. The roof tilted dangerously toward the flood. Below, the chicken coop tore free from its posts and spun away in the current. Lightning ripped the sky. For an instant, Ethan saw the world transformed, houses half submerged, trees uprooted, distant cries for help carried faint through the storm. Then a voice pierced the chaos, high-pitched, panicked, a child's cry. "Help! Somebody!" Ethan's head snapped toward the sound. Across the flood, clinging to a chimney, a boy's thin frame shook violently. His arms wrapped so tight they looked ready to break. Ethan recognized the face even through the storm. It was Caleb Turner, Clyde's youngest son. The same Clyde who had mocked him at the market, calling his pups devils. Now the boy was seconds from being swept away. Without hesitation, Ethan tied the rope tighter around his waist, securing the other end to the attic beam. "Axel," he barked, pointing toward the opposite roof. The blue-eyed shepherd sprang forward, ears flat, muscles driving him like an arrow into the flood. Ethan plunged in after him, Milo held against his chest, Rex swimming hard at his side, the canvas bag floating behind. The current was merciless, icy, tearing at Ethan's legs, pulling sideways. But Axel cut through the torrent like a spear, head held above the waves. Rex, teeth clamped on the bag's strap, kicked with every ounce of strength, refusing to let go. Milo pressed tighter against Ethan, trembling but silent. Every muscle in Ethan's body screamed as the rope at his waist yanked him taut, fighting the flood. Still, he pressed forward. At last, they reached the turner's roof. Caleb's face was white with terror, his fingers bloodied from clinging to brick. "Don't let go!" Ethan shouted above the storm. Axel scrambled onto the roof first, claws gripping shingles, bracing himself beside the boy, growling at the water as though daring it closer. Ethan shoved Milo up, then gripped Caleb's wrist. "I've got you," he said firmly, hauling him onto the roof, pressing the boy between himself and Axel. The flood surged again, water clawing against the house, but the rope held taut. Milo licked Caleb's chin, quieting his sobs. Rex clambered up last, drenched and shivering but still gripping the bag. For the first time, the fearful shepherd had been fearless. Together, man and dogs guided the boy back hand over hand along the rope, fighting each surge until at last they reached the Ward cabin. Ethan collapsed onto the roof, Caleb in his arms, crying, but alive. From higher houses along the levee, lanterns flickered. Neighbors had seen it, the Marine and his 3 dogs defying the river itself. Axel stood tall, chest heaving, blue eyes fierce. Rex panted, the bag still between his paws. Milo pressed close to Caleb, nuzzling until the boy's sobs broke into shaky laughter. That night, the flood rewrote Riverbend's whispers. The Marine's dogs were no longer curses. No longer burdens. They were heroes. The floodwaters took days to retreat. When they finally pulled back, Riverbend lay coated in mud and silt, fences broken, chicken coops overturned, the sour smell of rot heavy in the air. Slowly, life returned. Roofs were patched with tar, neighbors swapped saws and hammers without words, chickens were coaxed back into rebuilt pens. For Ethan, the flood had carved out more than ruin. It had carved respect. Where once whispers followed him, now hats tipped as he passed. Some faces still cautious, but many filled with gratitude. They had seen his dogs leap into the torrent without hesitation. They had seen Axel swim like a spear, Rex drag the supply sack through the flood, Milo steady a frightened boy with a single touch.